In the corporate world, a good executive secretary is the only thing standing between a CEO and total collapse. I managed schedules, drafted delicate correspondence, and anticipated disasters before the board of directors even smelled smoke. I was the best administrative professional in my city. Unfortunately, I couldn't organize gravity. While working late to find a misfiled contract, a towering, 2-ton mahogany filing cabinet tipped over and crushed me. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in my office. I was freezing, lying on a thick snow fox rug in a fortress carved out of dark, jagged stone. I had transmigrated into the Jade Crown, a sprawling melodramatic historical fantasy novel I'd read on my train commutes. And my luck was abysmal. I was Lady Wei, a universally hated noblewoman exiled to the frozen borders to marry the novel's ultimate antagonist, General Shen, the Mad Warlord. According to the plot, Shen was a bloodthirsty monster. In exactly 30 days, Crown Prince Jin, the golden hero of the empire, was going to march an army of righteous cultivators up here, take Shen's head, and execute me for being his wicked bride. I stood up, wrapping a heavy fur cloak around my silk nightgown. 30 days until my public execution. The timeline was tight, but I had managed tighter project deadlines. The heavy ironwood doors to my bedchamber suddenly violently exploded inward, the latch turning to splinters. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked like a literal god of war. He was massive, clad in spiked, terrifying obsidian armor, with eyes like cracked ice and a jagged scar running over the bridge of his nose. He radiated an aura of pure, suffocating malice. This was General Shen. He glared at me, his hand resting on a broadsword the size of a table. He opened his mouth, clearly preparing to deliver a terrifying threat. "I apologize," Shen started, his deep voice unexpectedly hesitant and entirely devoid of malice. A faint, horrified blush crept up his thick neck. He stared intently at his boots. I broke the door. The handle was sticking, and I pulled too hard. "I will have the carpenter fix it by nightfall." Did you sleep adequately?" I blinked. The aura of terrifying malice was still there, but the man generating it was currently fidgeting with the pommel of his sword like a nervous junior clerk. My administrative instincts fired on all cylinders. The jagged armor, the dark, unlit corridors, the terrifying magical aura. He wasn't a bloodthirsty monster. He was simply a disorganized introvert with a terrible public image and zero administrative support. Prince Jin was using Shen's horrible aesthetic to paint him as a villain and justify a land grab for the North Silver Mines. "General," I said slowly, stepping over the splinters of my door, "we need to address your public optics. And by optics, I mean we need to ensure the peasants don't think you eat children for breakfast." He looked at me as if I had lost my mind. "I am a warlord. The commoners run from me." "Not anymore," I declared, marching past him into the hallway. "We have 30 days to fix your reputation before the Golden Prince arrives. I am taking over your schedule, your correspondence, and your wardrobe. You aren't the Mad Warlord anymore. You are the tragic, misunderstood guardian of the North. Let's get to work." Chapter 1. General Shen, I said, stepping smoothly over the splintered remains of my bedchamber door, my fur cloak trailing over the freezing stone. "If we are to survive the month, we are going to need candles. A great deal of candles, and an immediate inspection of your archives." Shen stood frozen in the hallway. He was a mountain of dark, jagged iron and muscle, holding a broadsword that looked heavy enough to cleave a warhorse in two. Yet, the way he stared at me suggested I had just spoken to him in a forgotten, ancient tongue. "My archives?" he repeated, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated against the stone walls. "Your scrolls. Your ledgers. The sum total of your correspondence," I clarified, adopting the exact tone I used when a senior official claimed they had misplaced a vital trade agreement. "Lead the way." I did not wait for his permission. I simply walked past him, trusting that the sheer, unyielding momentum of my authority would force him to follow. It did. The Mad Warlord of the Northern Wastes fell into step behind me, his heavy, spiked boots remarkably quiet on the stone as he guided me to his private study. When he pushed the heavy oak doors open, I had to suppress a weary sigh. The room was vast, freezing, and plunged into an oppressive gloom, lit by a single, sputtering oil lamp. But the darkness was not the true horror. The true horror was the state of his desk. Hundreds of military scrolls, taxation ledgers, and imperial edicts were piled into haphazard, teetering mountains. A priceless jade paperweight was being used to prop up a rusted dagger. And what looked like an urgent missive from the southern border was currently acting as a coaster for a half-empty cup of cold tea. "General," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "How do you locate your quarterly grain tallies?" Shin shifted his massive weight, the iron plates of his armor grinding together. He pointed a thick, scarred finger toward the largest, most unstable pile of parchment on the left. "They are, in there. Somewhere. Usually." I closed my eyes, summoning the patience of a saint. This is why the Empire thinks you are a monster. Not because of your face, but because your administrative practices are a chaotic void. I turned to face him, crossing my arms. "Starting tomorrow, the spiked armor is banished. It ruins the upholstery and makes you look like a bandit king. Secondly, you will instruct the servants to light this fortress properly. A man who sits in the dark appears to have something to hide." Shin frowned, the jagged scar across his nose deepening. He looked terrifying, like a storm about to break. "I am the commander of the Northern Vanguard. I do not care what the Southern courts think of my lighting. You will care when Crown Prince Jean uses your gloomy aesthetic as an excuse to burn this fortress to the ground." I countered sharply, stepping closer to him. Despite having to tilt my head entirely backward to meet his icy gaze, I did not yield an inch. "We are going to make you an upstanding, organized pillar of the Empire. And to do that, I must know exactly what sort of mess I am cleaning up." I turned on my heel. "Take me to your dungeons." The Warlord blinked, clearly caught off guard. "The lower levels? They are damp, freezing, and entirely unsuitable for a noblewoman. There is nothing for you to see." "Do not attempt to manage me, General," I warned. "The rumors claim you torture prisoners of war for sport. If there are bodies down there or half-starved captives, I need to know so I can clear the ledgers and prepare our defense. Take me down there. Now." For a moment, I thought he might argue. His jaw clenched, and his hand tightened on the hilt of his massive sword. But then, with a heavy, resigned sigh that sounded completely out of place coming from a warlord, he turned and led the way toward the spiraling stone stairs. The air grew bitterly cold as we descended deep into the bedrock of the fortress. The only sound was the drip of freezing water and the echo of our footsteps. We reached the bottom of the stairs, stopping before a massive, reinforced iron door secured by a heavy sliding bolt. "Stand back," Shin muttered, stepping forward to grip the rusted iron bar. I held my breath, bracing myself for the stench of blood, the sight of chains, and the terrifying reality of the man I had been forced to marry. I mentally drafted 3 different apologies to the imperial courts. With a loud screech of metal, Shin threw the heavy door open. I stepped into the dimly lit cell, my eyes adjusting to the shadows, fully prepared for the worst. Resting on a massive, meticulously fluffed pile of clean straw and expensive silk blankets was a fully grown, terrifyingly large snow leopard. It let out a low, rumbling chuff at the sight of us. I froze, my eyes darting from its massive fangs to its hind leg, which was carefully, expertly wrapped in clean linen bandages and supported by a perfectly carved wooden splint. Beside the beast was a silver platter piled high with premium, freshly sliced venison. The snow leopard purred, resting its massive head gently against Shin's spiked boot. Chapter 2. "General," I said, my voice cutting through the tense silence of the drawing room. "If you sigh one more time, I will instruct the master tailor to take that tunic in another inch." Shin stood rigidly in the center of the chamber, his massive arms held out to his sides like a terrified scarecrow. 2 of the finest local tailors, who were sweating profusely and trembling like leaves in a winter storm, darted around him with measuring strings and chalk. In the corner of the room, piled unceremoniously like discarded scrap metal, was his beloved obsidian armor. It had taken a full hour of relentless bureaucratic nagging to convince him to take it off. "I feel entirely exposed," Shin grumbled, his icy eyes darting toward his armor. "If an assassin were to breach the fortress right now, this silk would offer 0 resistance against a blade. If an assassin breaches the fortress, you can use that massive broadsword you refused to leave in the armory," I countered, sitting at a polished wooden table, a freshly organized stack of inventory ledgers resting before me. "You are not marching into a vanguard skirmish, Shin. You are ruling a province. You need to look like a man who commands respect, rather than a bandit chief preparing to pillage a village." I stood up and circled him, evaluating the tailor's progress. The transformation was already staggering. Gone were the jagged iron spikes and the imposing, blood-dark metals. Instead, he wore layers of heavy, muted silks in deep charcoal and storm cloud gray. The fabric fell flawlessly over his broad shoulders, secured by finely tooled, dark leather bracers at his wrists and a wide, silver-clasped belt at his waist. He no longer looked like a monster. He looked like an imperial scholar general, dignified, incredibly powerful, and devastatingly handsome. I paused in front of him, tapping my chin. The silhouette is excellent, but the collar is completely wrong. Before the terrified tailors could apologize, I stepped directly into Shun's personal space. I was barely 5 feet tall. He was a mountain of muscle that blocked out the sunlight from the nearby window. "Lower your chin, General," I ordered softly. Shun froze. He slowly lowered his head, his icy eyes widening marginally as I reached up. My fingers brushed against the warm, pulse-heavy skin of his throat as I firmly grasped the stiff silk collar of his inner robe, smoothing out a severe crease and adjusting the fold so it sat symmetrically against his jawline. For a man who supposedly waded through battlefields without flinching, the warlord of the Northern Wastes was currently holding his breath as if a single sudden movement would shatter us both. I could feel the erratic, hammering rhythm of his pulse beneath my knuckles. His gaze dropped, locking onto my face with an intensity that made the chill in the room completely vanish. "You are." Shin started, his deep voice dropping to a gravelly, barely there whisper. He swallowed hard, his throat working against my fingertips. "You are very close, Lady Wei. Attention to detail is the foundation of good administration," I replied, though my own voice lacked its usual crisp authority. I smoothed my thumb over the edge of the dark silk one last time. My eyes caught in the heavy, stormy depths of his. "My lord." The sharp bark of the fortress's captain of the guard shattered the silence. The captain bowed deeply, his face pale. "Forgive the intrusion, General, but a royal envoy has just breached the valley gates. He bears the golden seal." Shen's expression instantly darkened, the awkward, blushing giant replaced entirely by the cold, hardened commander. He stepped in front of me, shielding my body with his own as the envoy. A sneering, silk-clad official from the southern capital marched into the room flanked by 4 heavily armed imperial guards. The envoy did not bow. He unrolled a brilliant, shimmering golden scroll, the emblem of Crown Prince Jean practically glowing in the dim light. "By order of His Imperial Highness Crown Prince Jean," the envoy announced, his voice dripping with condescension. "General Shun of the Northern Wastes is hereby charged with treason, barbarism, and the harboring of dark forces. You are to surrender your command, your fortress, and your betrothed immediately. Should you refuse, the righteous armies of the South will..." Chapter 3. General Shun's hand moved toward his broadsword with lethal, terrifying intent. The envoy swallowed hard, taking a rapid step backward, suddenly realizing that holding a shiny golden scroll did not make him immune to being cleaved in half. I stepped in front of Shin, gently placing a hand over his thick, leather-clad wrist. The sheer heat radiating from his skin was astonishing, but I kept my posture impeccably professional. "The general acknowledges the receipt of the Crown Prince's decree," I said crisply, offering the envoy a shallow, perfectly measured bow. "In writing." The envoy sneered, recovering his false bravado. "The mad warlord knows how to write?" Shin let out a low, vibrating growl that made the glass in the windows rattle. The envoy flinched, turned on his heel, and practically sprinted out of the drawing room with his guards. The moment the doors shut, Shin turned to me, his icy eyes blazing with absolute fury. "I am going to mount his head on the fortress gates." I forced Shin to sit at his heavy mahogany desk. I laid out a fresh sheet of premium parchment, dipped a fine wolf hair brush into the inkstone, and poised my hand over the page. "Dictate your response, General. And please try to refrain from mentioning severed limbs." Shin scowled, staring at the blank parchment as if it were a trap. "Tell the prince that if he marches his armies north, I will feed his heart to the snow leopards and dye the frozen plains red with his soldiers' blood." I sighed, bringing the brush to the paper. "I see." Translating. My hand flew across the parchment in elegant, sweeping calligraphy. "The general expresses his most profound sorrow at the prospect of shedding imperial blood. His only desire has ever been to silently bear the heavy, frozen burden of protecting the empire's vulnerable borders, asking for neither glory nor reward in return. And tell him," Shin continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble, "that his golden magic is a pathetic parlor trick, and I will shatter his bones with my bare hands." It brings the general great grief to see the esteemed crown prince misled by malicious whispers. I wrote smoothly. We humbly beg the prince to reconsider this unprovoked aggression against his most loyal, long-suffering servants in the north. I blew gently on the ink to dry it, then stamped the bottom with Shun's heavy iron seal. I quickly copied the letter 3 more times. Shun frowned, leaning over the desk to look at the extra scrolls. Why are you making copies? The prince only requires 1 missive. 1 is for the prince, I explained, rolling the parchments and securing them with black ribbons. The others are being dispatched to the most popular tea houses, scholar pavilions, and traveling bards in the southern capital. We are not just answering a threat, General. We are circulating a public notice. By the time the prince receives his copy, the entire capital will have read the tragic, eloquent words of the Miss. Shin stared at me, a profound mixture of awe and slight terror in his eyes. You battle with paper. It is much more efficient than swords, I assured him. We walked out onto the high, freezing battlements to watch Shun's most trusted courier depart. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the snow-choked valley. The rider spurred his horse, galloping out of the heavy iron gates and down the narrow mountain pass, carrying our carefully crafted reputation. I pulled my fur cloak tighter against the biting wind, feeling a rare surge of triumph. The administration was working. We were ahead of schedule. But as I watched the rider disappear into the valley, a shadow shifted in the dense, snow-laden pines bordering the road. 5 figures clad in white cloaks stepped silently out of the tree line. The fading sunlight glinted off the drawn, notched arrows of their heavy crossbows, and all 5 weapons were aimed squarely at the back of our retreating courier. Chapter 4. Before the mercenaries could even release their bowstrings, the air pressure on the battlements violently dropped. General Shun did not shout. He did not call for the guards. He simply placed his massive, leather-clad hand flat against the freezing stone parapet. Down in the valley, the 5 mercenaries were instantly encased in thick, jagged pillars of solid frost, frozen perfectly in place before they could loose a single arrow. The courier, completely unaware of his near-death experience, rode peacefully around the bend and out of sight. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, mentally checking off a very large box on my itinerary. Excellent crisis management, General. The correspondence is secure. Shin straightened, the terrifying aura instantly retracting back into his imposing frame. He looked down at the frozen statues in the valley, his jaw clenched. Prince Jin's hounds. He sent them ahead of the envoy to ensure no ravens or riders left my lands. He intends to control the narrative. He intended to. I corrected, turning away from the wall. But written word is only the first phase of an optics overhaul. We have to substantiate our claims. Tomorrow morning, we are conducting a public asset distribution. Shin frowned, trailing after me like a very large, lethal shadow. A what? We are taking a carriage, for carts of your premium imperial grain reserves, and riding down to the Silver River village, I instructed. You are going to hand out rations. You are going to look benevolent. And if physically possible, you are going to smile. The next morning, the village of Silver River looked less like a thriving settlement, and more like a frozen ghost town. The peasants peeked out from behind warped wooden shutters, their faces pale with terror as the dreaded warlord of the north rode into their square. I stepped down from the carriage, holding a wooden clipboard I had commissioned from the fortress carpenter. Shin followed, looking deeply uncomfortable in his elegant charcoal silks. Shoulders back, General, I murmured, keeping my eyes on my ledger. Pass the grain to the village elder. Be gentle. Remember, they are taxpayers, not enemy combatants. Shin awkwardly approached the trembling village elder, holding out a heavy sack of rice as if it were a bomb. The elder took it, bowing so low his forehead practically touched the snow. The villagers watched in stunned silence. The mad warlord wasn't burning their homes. He was distributing supplies. Slowly, cautiously, the peasants began to form a line. It was tense, but the administrative framework was holding. Until a shout rang out from the edge of the village. The ice dam. A sudden, unnatural spring thaw had weakened the frozen river bordering the village. A massive chunk of ice violently gave way, sending a raging torrent of freezing, black water rushing toward the lower houses. The villagers screamed, scattering in panic. My heart leapt into my throat as I saw a small boy, who had been chasing a stray chicken near the banks, lose his footing in the mud. He slipped, tumbling directly into the path of the raging, freezing rapids. Before I could even shout, a gust of wind knocked me back. Shin was gone. He didn't run. He moved like a force of nature. He threw himself in front of the rushing floodwaters, slamming his heavy boots into the mud. He didn't use a sword. He unleashed the absolute, terrifying zenith of his dark magic. A pulse of deep blue energy exploded from his body. The raging river slammed into his magical barrier and froze instantly, transforming from a deadly flood into a towering, jagged sculpture of solid ice just inches from the screaming child. The village went dead silent. Shin breathed heavily, the dark magic receding. He carefully reached down with one massive hand, plucked the terrified boy out of the mud by the collar of his coat, and gently set him down on dry ground. "Go to your mother," Shin grunted softly. The boy's mother ran forward, weeping hysterically, pulling her child into her arms. She looked up at the towering warlord, and instead of cowering, she fell to her knees in the snow. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you, Lord Protector." The title rippled through the crowd. Lord Protector. Not Mad Warlord. The villagers began to drop to their knees, their earlier terror replaced by profound, overwhelming gratitude. Cheers broke out, echoing off the mountains. Shin stood in the snow, completely bewildered by the sound of people cheering for him. He slowly turned his head to look at me standing by the grain carts. The hardened lines of his face softened, and for the first time since I met him, the terrifying general offered a small, genuinely beautiful smile. I smiled back, lifting my brush to make a note on my clipboard about the overwhelming success of our community outreach. A sharp, violent thwack split the air. The heavy wood of the grain cart shattered right beside my ear. I froze, my eyes slowly trailing to the left. Embedded inches from my face, vibrating violently in the wooden paneling, was a black-fletched arrow dripping with a viscous, glowing green poison. Chapter 5. I didn't even have time to blink. The green poison hissed violently against the wood, eating through the thick lacquer of the cart mere inches from my cheek. Before the sound of the impact fully registered, the temperature in the village square plummeted. It was as if winter itself had violently inhaled. The warm, awkward general who had just saved a child vanished completely. In his place stood the mad warlord. Shin's eyes, previously a soft, uncertain gray, turned black as a starless night. He didn't draw his sword. He didn't issue a command. He simply became a blur. A streak of charcoal silk and crackling, lethal frost shot toward the tree line. The villagers screamed, the hard-won goodwill evaporating in an instant as they scrambled away in pure, unadulterated terror. I watched frozen, as Shin dragged a man in white mercenary armor out of the pines by his throat. The assassin thrashed, clawing at Shin's leather bracers, but Shin slammed him into the frozen earth with enough force to crack the bedrock beneath the snow. Jagged, terrifying spikes of black ice erupted from the ground, pinning the assassin's limbs without piercing his vitals. Shin stood over him, radiating an aura of pure murder. The villagers were cowering behind their doors again. The public outreach was officially a disaster. I let out a slow, steady breath, picked up my wooden clipboard, and made a sharp, disappointed mark on the parchment. An hour later, the heavy ironwood doors of Shun's private study slammed shut. "General," I said, setting my records down on his desk with a firm thwack. "While I appreciate the executive defense, publicly maiming an assassin in front of the taxpayers entirely negated the morning's progress. You terrified the constituency." Shin paced the room like a caged beast, his breathing heavy, the dark magic still practically rolling off his shoulders. "He fired a poisoned arrow at your head. And he missed," I pointed out smoothly, folding my hands. "If you had simply subdued him and handed him over to the guards, we could have held a public tribunal. It would have demonstrated a commitment to the rule of law. Instead, you reinforced the narrative that you are a volatile." Shin closed the distance between us so fast the air rushed from my lungs. He didn't yell. Instead, he slammed his massive palms flat against the stone wall on either side of my head, trapping me completely. "Do not speak to me of narratives," he growled, his voice a raw, terrifying rumble that vibrated straight through my chest. He leaned in, his icy eyes burning with a desperate intensity that made my perfectly organized thoughts completely scatter. "An inch to the right, way, and you would be dead. Do you think I care about the villagers' whispers? Do you think I care about the prince's decree or the empire's ledgers if it costs me your life?" I swallowed hard. I was used to managing angry executives, but no one had ever looked at me like this. I was intensely aware of the sheer heat of his body, the scent of winter pine, and the terrifying realization that this massive, dangerous warlord was entirely at my mercy. Shun. I started, my administrative vocabulary completely failing me. My reputation means nothing, he whispered fiercely, his forehead dropping to rest lightly against mine. You are the only thing in this frozen wasteland I will not allow to be taken from me. The air in the cold study grew thick. The strict professional boundaries I had drawn between us were rapidly dissolving. He tilted his head, his gaze dropping to my lips. My pulse hammered against my throat, and I found myself leaning upward. A shadow detached itself from the corner of the room. My lord, a voice said smoothly. Shin squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a heavy, deeply frustrated sigh. He stepped back, instantly resuming his rigid posture as a commander, though a faint flush remained on his neck. Report. A dead end, Shin muttered, crossing his arms. Not entirely, the captain replied, holding up a blood-stained parchment. We searched his garments. I took the map from the guard, my eyes quickly scanning the marked troop movements and supply lines. The logistical numbers didn't add up. I traced the primary route with my finger, the blood rapidly draining from my face as I realized what I was looking at. General, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. Prince Jean isn't marching with a standard vanguard. He's abandoning his supply trains and utilizing a forced cavalry march through the eastern mountain pass. Shin frowned, moving to look over my shoulder. That route is treacherous. If he pushes his men that hard, he will arrive. Not in 30 days, I finished, rolling the map tightly in my hands. He is 10 days away. Chapter 6. 10 days. The entire administrative schedule had to be ruthlessly compressed. We are accelerating the timeline, I announced to the fortress staff, standing at the head of the long wooden table in the kitchens. The winter solstice is in 3 days. We are hosting a diplomatic banquet. I need the grand hall scrubbed until the stones gleam, 300 silk lanterns hung from the rafters, and a menu that projects prosperity without appearing decadent. The fortress servants, who had spent the last decade assuming they would die in this frozen wasteland, scrambled to execute my orders with a terrifying, coordinated efficiency. My next task was far more difficult, preparing the general. You are crushing the teacup, Shin, I said with a sigh, sitting across from him in the study. Shin looked down at the delicate porcelain in his massive hand. A hairline fracture ran straight down the side of the painted ceramic. It is too small. It lacks tactical weight. It is meant for drinking jasmine tea, not for bludgeoning infantrymen, I instructed, replacing the ruined cup with a fresh one. When Matriarch Lin of the River Clan speaks to you, you will hold the cup gently. You will ask about the health of her eldest grandson. You will not mention the time you sank 3 of her trade ships during the border skirmishes. Shin grimaced, looking utterly miserable in his immaculate, dark silk robes. I am a soldier, Wei. I do not know how to smile at people I do not trust. You do not need to trust them, I replied softly, stepping closer to adjust the silver clasp of his belt. You just need to make them feel valued. A well-placed compliment is a far better defense than a barricaded door. The night of the solstice banquet arrived, and the transformation of the fortress was absolute. The great hall was bathed in the warm, golden light of hundreds of lanterns. The massive hearths roared with fragrant pine wood, and the tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats and spiced wines. The neutral clan leaders, who had arrived expecting a grim, terrifying warlord, were completely disarmed. I stood at the edge of the room, holding a small scroll to track the guest list. I watched Shen with a critical eye, but I found absolutely nothing to correct. He moved through the crowd with surprising grace, his sheer size commanding respect while his quiet, restrained demeanor projected a dignified calm. I watched as Matriarch Lin approached him. Shen bowed flawlessly, held his teacup without shattering it, and murmured something that made the stern, elderly woman let out a delighted, ringing laugh. He was brilliant. I let out a breath, finally allowing my shoulders to drop. The administration was a success. We had secured the neutral clans. As the musicians shifted into a slow, sweeping melody, the crowd parted slightly. Shin excused himself from the matriarch and walked straight across the hall, his icy eyes locking directly onto mine. The low murmur of the nobility faded into the background. He stopped in front of me and offered a deep, formal bow, extending one large, calloused hand. Lady Wei, will you honor me? General, I murmured, my heart suddenly racing a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I am staff. I should be monitoring the kitchens. The kitchens are fine, he rumbled, his voice dropping to a register meant only for me. You have managed the entire northern province. Allow me to manage this. I placed my hand in his. He pulled me gently but firmly onto the floor. For a man accustomed to the brutal footwork of a battlefield, Shen was an incredibly graceful dancer. He kept one hand firmly on my waist. We spun slowly under the golden lanterns. The room around us blurred. There was only the heavy, comforting scent of winter pine and the intense, undeniable heat of his gaze. You look beautiful, Shen whispered, his thumb lightly tracing the line of my spine. You have saved my life, my province, and my people. I do not know how I will ever repay you. A generous pension plan would be a start, I whispered back, though my voice was trembling. Shen's lips curved into a devastatingly soft smile. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, the air between us thick with an unspoken, desperate affection. He closed his eyes, his lips parting as he tilted his head to close the distance. A deafening, explosive crash ripped through the music. The massive ironwood doors of the great hall were violently kicked open, the heavy bolts shattering inward and sending splinters flying across the polished stone floor. The music abruptly died. The nobles shrieked, scrambling backward in terror. Standing in the doorway, bathed in a blinding, unnatural golden light, was a man in gleaming imperial armor. His sword was drawn, and flanking him were 50 elite paladins of the southern capital. Crown Prince Jean had arrived a week early. Chapter 7. The golden light pouring from Crown Prince Jean was not warm. It was blinding, heavy, and suffocatingly sweet, like the scent of rotting lotus flowers. He strode into the great hall with the absolute arrogance of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. His golden armor chimed with every step, and his handsome, perfectly sculpted face was set in a mask of righteous fury. The neutral clan leaders, who had been laughing and drinking only moments before, immediately fell silent, their eyes glazing over slightly as the prince's unnatural aura washed over the room. I recognized the tactic immediately. It was the imperial equivalent of walking into a board meeting and screaming fraud, before the opposition even had a chance to open their ledgers. General Shen. Prince Jin's voice boomed, magically amplified to shake the remaining dust from the rafters. Your reign of terror over the northern wastes ends tonight. Lay down your arms, and I may grant you a swift execution. Shen did not draw his sword. He stepped smoothly in front of me, his broad shoulders completely shielding me from the prince's blinding light. The soft, gentle man I had just been dancing with vanished, replaced instantly by the rigid, impenetrable commander of the vanguard. You bring armed soldiers into a diplomatic banquet, Your Highness, Shen rumbled, his voice cold and steady. You break my doors and threaten my guests. Who is the one spreading terror? Do not attempt to twist the truth, you monster, Jean sneered, taking another step forward. He swept his arm toward the terrified nobles. I see what you are doing. You are using dark, forbidden arts to beguile the minds of these honorable clan leaders. And worse. Jin's gaze snapped to me, standing just behind Shen's arm. The prince's eyes burned with a manufactured, theatrical pity. You have used your foul sorcery to control the mind of Lady Wei, Jean declared loudly, ensuring every person in the hall heard him. A pure, innocent woman of the court, twisted into serving a beast. But fear not, Lady Wei. The Empire has come to your rescue. I stepped out from behind Shen, smoothing the skirts of my silk dress, entirely unamused by his grandstanding. Your Highness, I assure you my mind is entirely my own. Jean did not listen. Arrogant men rarely listen to the staff. He lunged forward, bypassing Shen's guard with a sudden, unnatural burst of magical speed, and clamped his heavy, gauntlet hand directly onto my wrist. His grip was bruising. You do not have to speak for him anymore, my lady, Jean commanded, pulling me violently toward him. The spell is broken. The second Jin's hand touched me, the temperature in the great hall dropped to absolute zero. Remove your hand from my betrothed. Shen's voice was no longer a rumble. It was the sound of a glacier cracking in half. Jean smirked, his eyes flashing with triumph. This was exactly what he wanted. He wanted the monster to show his teeth in front of the Empire's most important witnesses. Jean tightened his grip on my wrist, digging the metal of his gauntlet into my skin. Shen's control, the ironclad restraint we had spent weeks building, completely and violently snapped. A shockwave of pure, black frost erupted from Shun's boots. It tore across the polished stone floor, instantly freezing the wine in the goblets and coating the banquet tables in jagged, terrifying spikes of dark ice. The sheer pressure of his dark magic hit the ceiling with the force of a battering ram. High above us, all 300 carefully hung crystal lanterns instantly shattered under the magical strain. The great hall plunged into absolute darkness, save for the sickly golden glow of the prince's armor. Glass rained down on the screaming nobles. The clan leaders fled in blind terror, shouting that the mad warlord was trying to slaughter them all. The careful, meticulous reputation we had built over the last 10 days was annihilated in Chapter 8. The broadsword in Shun's hand gleamed in the sickly golden light, its edge perfectly angled to sever Prince Jin's head from his shoulders. If Shun swung that blade, he would be committing high treason in front of 50 imperial paladins and a dozen fleeing clan leaders. We would be executed before dawn. I needed an immediate, undeniable de-escalation protocol. I didn't hesitate. I forced my eyes to roll back into my head, let all the tension leave my limbs, and collapsed like a beautifully dressed sack of imperial rice. I didn't even hit the floor. Before Prince Jin could drag me down with him, Shun dropped his broadsword with a deafening clatter. He caught me before my knees grazed the frost-covered stone, pulling me flush against his chest. "Wei!" Shun roared, the dark, suffocating magic instantly vanishing from the room, replaced entirely by raw, visceral panic. "What foul sorcery?" Prince Jin stammered, stepping back as his paladins quickly formed a protective wall around him. "If she stops breathing, I will tear you apart with my bare hands," Shun snarled over his shoulder, his voice echoing through the ruined hall. He didn't wait for the prince to issue another decree. He scooped me up into his arms as if I weighed no more than a sparrow, turned on his heel, and sprinted toward the inner keep. He didn't stop until we were safely behind the reinforced iron doors of his private study. He laid me gently onto the velvet settee near the hearth, his massive hands trembling as he reached to check the pulse at my throat. "I require the royal physician," Shun shouted toward the door. "Bring him immediately." "Cancel the physician," I said, opening my eyes and sitting up briskly. I smoothed the wrinkled silk of my skirt and adjusted my hairpin. "I am perfectly fine. I just needed to force an adjournment before you committed regicide in the dining hall." Shun froze, his hand hovering mid-air. The sheer terror in his icy eyes slowly shifted into profound, staggering relief, and then into a heavy, crushing guilt. He dropped to his knees beside the settee, burying his face in his hands. "I ruined it," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You worked for weeks to build that piece. You made them see a man, and I gave them the monster. I failed you." I softened, reaching out to gently rest my hand on his broad, shaking shoulder. "You didn't fail me, Shun. You protected me." Jin deliberately engineered that scenario. He knew exactly which button to press. I stood up, moving toward his desk. But playing defensively is no longer viable. We cannot outsmile a man who emits literal golden light. We need to go on the offensive. Shun looked up, his expression hardening as he rose to his feet. "You want me to marshal the vanguard?" "I want you to marshal your spies," I corrected, unrolling a blank sheet of parchment. Prince Jin's entire campaign relies on his image as the golden hero. But flawless men do not exist. Everyone leaves a paper trail. I want your elite shadow guards to infiltrate the southern capital. Bring me his tax records, his travel logs, and his private requisition orders. For the next 3 days, the fortress was under a strict lockdown. Prince Jin's forces camped at the edge of the valley, waiting for reinforcements, while I turned Shun's study into a war room of ledgers and scrolls. I barely slept. I treated the prince's life like a hostile administrative audit, cross-referencing his military movements with his provincial expenditures. Shun stayed by my side the entire time, quietly keeping the hearth fire blazing and wordlessly replacing my cold tea with fresh, steaming cups. On the third night, near the hour of the wolf, my ink brush finally stopped moving. I stared at the 3 scrolls spread across the mahogany desk. My blood ran cold. "Shun," I whispered, the silence of the room suddenly feeling incredibly heavy. He was at my shoulder in a fraction of a second. "What is it? Did you find a missing shipment of gold?" "Worse," I breathed, tracing my trembling finger along the columns of data. "Look at his travel logs. Every time the prince visits a remote southern village, he performs a miracle of golden light. But look at the census records for those exact same villages 2 weeks later. Shen leaned over the desk, his eyes narrowing as he read the imperial characters. A sudden outbreak of wasting sickness. Unexplained deaths among the young and healthy. It's not a sickness, I said, a wave of absolute nausea washing over me as the horrifying truth locked into place. I looked up into Shen's horrified eyes. His magic isn't divine. It's parasitic. The Crown Prince is secretly draining the life force of his own commoners to power his golden aura. The hero of the Empire was the true monster, and I held the paperwork to prove it. Chapter 9. To expose a fraud of this magnitude, we could not simply nail the ledgers to the fortress gates. Prince Jean had the unwavering faith of the Empire. If the mad warlord accused him of blood magic, the courts would dismiss it as the desperate lies of a cornered beast. We needed a flawless chain of custody. We needed a whistleblower. Grand Scholar phone, I said, sealing the copied ledgers inside a waterproof oiled leather tube. He is the head of the Imperial Archives. He has no clan affiliations, he despises court politics, and his word is considered absolute law by the magistrates. If he presents the discrepancies in the census reports, the Emperor will be forced to launch an investigation. Shen stood by the window, staring out at the prince's distant encampment. Feng is currently traveling through the Middle Kingdoms. He is camped less than 5 miles from our borders. But it is too dangerous way. Let me send a shadow guard to deliver the documents. A shadow guard cannot explain the cross-reference data. I insisted, tapping the leather tube. I have to present the findings personally. I have arranged a mediation meeting at the Whispering Pines Pavilion, halfway between our gates and the valley's edge. Neutral ground. Shen turned, his jaw set in a hard, stubborn line. Then I am coming with you. A warlord attending a clandestine meeting looks like an ambush. I am coming with you, Shen repeated, his voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. He crossed the room, wrapping a thick, fur-lined cloak heavily over my shoulders. I will wait in the tree line, but you will not step foot outside these walls without my blade at your back. The Whispering Pines Pavilion was a delicate, open-air wooden structure built over a frozen koi pond, surrounded by ancient, snow-heavy trees. It was bitterly cold, the kind of winter stillness that made every breath sound uncomfortably loud. I stood in the center of the pavilion, my hands tucked into my sleeves, the leather tube resting on the stone table before me. Hidden somewhere in the dark pines behind me was Shen. I couldn't see him, but I could feel the heavy, protective weight of his presence like a physical shield. Right on time, a solitary figure emerged from the snowy path leading up the mountain. Grand Scholar Feng looked exactly as the imperial text described him. An elderly, frail man with a long white beard, leaning heavily on a gnarled wooden staff, wearing the unadorned gray robes of an ascetic academic. I offered a deep, respectful bow as he stepped into the pavilion. Grand Scholar, thank you for agreeing to this mediation. Lady Wei, the old man wheezed, his voice thin and papery. He eyed the leather tube on the table. Your missive claimed you possess documents of dire consequence to the Empire's stability. I do, I said, stepping forward. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I unrolled the primary ledger, pointing to the columns I had painstakingly highlighted. These are the prince's requisition orders, cross-referenced with the provincial death tolls. He is not drawing light from the heavens, Scholar. He is extracting it from the peasantry. The golden hero is committing mass murder. The old scholar leaned over the table, his milky eyes scanning the precise, undeniable mathematics of the slaughter. He reached out a trembling, wrinkled hand, his fingers brushing against the edge of the parchment. Fascinating, the scholar murmured. As his fingers gripped the paper, the wrinkled I froze. The illusion dissolved like wet paint running down a canvas. The gray robes melted into vibrant, luxurious crimson silk. The stooped posture straightened, growing taller, broader. The white beard vanished entirely, revealing the sharp, arrogant face of a much younger man with intricate, glowing runes tattooed across his neck. It wasn't the Grand Scholar. It was Prince Jin's High Court mage. His Highness suspected the little secretary might have found something in the dark. The mage sneered, his eyes glowing with a toxic, unnatural amber light. He sends his regards. And his severance. Shen, I screamed, lunging backward. The mage slammed his staff against the wooden floorboards of the pavilion. A massive shockwave of pure, blinding heat erupted from the wood. The entire pavilion didn't catch fire, it exploded into it. Roaring, unnatural walls of crimson and black flame shot 30 feet into the night sky, instantly vaporizing the frozen koi pond, and completely enclosing the wooden structure in an impenetrable cage of magical fire. The heat was instantaneous and agonizing, singeing the edges of my fur cloak in a fraction of a second. I was trapped inside the inferno, the air instantly sucked from my lungs, as the court mage began to laugh. Chapter 10. The heat was absolute, stripping the oxygen from my lungs in a matter of seconds. The heavy timber beams of the pavilion groaned, instantly charring black as the unnatural crimson flames curled toward the ceiling. The court mage stood safely at the edge of the inferno, his protective runes glowing, waiting for me to burn. I raised my arm to shield my face, the edges of my fur cloak already turning to ash. All my careful planning, the meticulous ledgers, the perfectly organized schedules, none of it mattered against the raw, brute force of magical fire. Then the eastern wall of the pavilion simply ceased to exist. It wasn't broken, it was violently obliterated by a battering ram of solid, crackling black ice. Through the blinding wall of fire stepped the mad warlord. Shin did not look like a dignified scholar general anymore. He was a force of absolute, terrifying destruction. He didn't bother drawing his broadsword. He threw both of his bare hands forward, unleashing a shockwave of dark, freezing magic that violently clashed with the mage's fire. The collision of extreme cold and unnatural heat created a deafening hiss, filling the pavilion with scalding white steam. "You dare!" the mage began, raising his staff. Shin didn't speak. He simply closed his fist. A jagged, massive stalagmite of black ice erupted from the floorboards directly beneath the mage, piercing his magical barrier, and sending him crashing through the burning railing into the ruined koi pond below. But the flames did not die with the mage's fall. The roof of the pavilion let out a catastrophic crack, the main support beam giving way. A massive, burning timber plummeted directly toward my head. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end. Instead, I was thrown violently to the floorboards. A heavy, solid weight covered me entirely, completely shielding my body from the falling debris. Shin had thrown his massive frame over mine. I heard a sickening hiss and a sharp, muffled grunt of pain vibrate through his chest as the burning timber struck his back. "Shun!" I screamed, my voice raw from the smoke. He didn't answer. He scooped me into his arms, his dark magic flaring one final time to blast a hole through the remaining wall of fire. He leaped from the collapsing structure, landing heavily in the deep snow of the surrounding pine forest. We tumbled together into the freezing drifts just as the Whispering Pines pavilion finally collapsed in upon itself in a shower of sparks. We lay in the snow, gasping for the freezing, clean air. I scrambled to my knees, my hands shaking violently. Shin was lying face down in the snow. The beautiful charcoal silk of his robes was completely burned away across his broad shoulders, revealing angry, blistering burns across his skin. My breath caught in my throat. I tore at the hem of my inner silk skirt, ripping the fabric into long strips with frantic, uncoordinated pulls. "Stay still," I ordered, my voice trembling wildly. "I need to bind this to prevent infection. The cold will help numb the tissue, but we need the physician." A massive, heavy hand gently closed over my frantic wrists. Shin slowly pushed himself up into a kneeling position, ignoring the horrific burns on his back. His face was covered in soot, his breathing ragged, but his icy eyes were fixed entirely on me with a piercing, absolute clarity. "Wei," he rumbled softly, his thumb brushing a streak of ash from my cheek. "You compromised your own structural integrity," I babbled, tears finally spilling over my lashes, freezing almost instantly in the cold air. "You took a direct hit. The administrative loss if you fall." "Damn the administration," Shin interrupted, his voice a fierce, raw whisper. He pulled my hands to his chest, pressing them over the frantic, hammering rhythm of his heart. "Do you not understand yet? The province, the army, the throne. I would let it all burn to ash if it meant keeping you safe." I stared up at him, the strict, professional walls I had built around my heart completely crumbling into dust. "I have loved you," Shin confessed, his words heavy and desperate in the quiet snow. "Since the day you walked into my darkness and refused to be afraid of me." There were no ledgers, no protocols, no schedules left to consult. I surged forward, throwing my arms around his neck and kissed him. Shin let out a low, desperate sound, his uninjured arm wrapping tightly around my waist, pulling me flush against his chest. He kissed me back with the fierce, overwhelming passion of a man who had spent his entire life in the freezing dark, and had finally found the sun. The cold of the snow, the pain of the fire, the threat of the empire, it all vanished in the heat of his mouth. We clung to each other in the shadows of the burning pavilion, the emotional dam finally breaking, leaving nothing but absolute certainty. But the empire rarely allows for peaceful certainty. A low, terrifying sound echoed through the frozen valley, vibrating through the soles of my shoes and shattering the quiet intimacy of the snow-covered pines. It was a long, mournful blast of a heavy brass war horn. Then another. And another. Shen broke the kiss, his head snapping toward the southern pass. The burning pavilion hadn't just been an assassination attempt. It was a beacon. Prince Jean had used the mediation meeting as a distraction to move his vanguard through the mountain pass under the cover of night. The Golden Army had arrived at the gates of the northern fortress. The siege had begun. Chapter 11. We barely made it through the heavy iron gates of the fortress before the first volley of flaming arrows rained down upon the courtyard. Shen's breathing was ragged, his burned shoulders protesting every movement, but he did not slow down. He handed me over to the captain of the guard the moment the gates were barred. "Take her to the deep vaults," Shen commanded, his voice slicing through the frantic shouting of the defending soldiers. He turned to me, his icy eyes fierce in the glow of the burning arrows. "Do not come to the surface until the horns sound the all clear. Do you understand me, Wei?" He didn't wait for my answer. He drew his massive broadsword, the dark ice magic swirling around the blade, and charged toward the crumbling eastern wall where Jin's paladins were already setting their siege ladders. I stood in the courtyard for exactly 3 seconds. "My lady, please," the captain urged, grabbing my arm. "The vaults." "I am the keeper of his records, Captain," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos erupting around me. I pulled my arm from his grasp, and I refused to let him fight a war of lies with a sword. "Where is the treasury?" I didn't hide. While the soldiers rushed to the walls with boiling pitch and heavy stones, I sprinted through the freezing corridors of the inner keep until I reached the locked treasury. I shattered the display case holding the Empire's most dangerous artifact, the Voice of the Mountain, a smooth, heavy piece of enchanted jade designed to amplify a commander's voice across miles of mountainous terrain. Clutching the jade and the oiled leather tube containing the prince's ledgers, I hiked up the winding, treacherous stone stairs to the highest battlement of the fortress. The wind howled, whipping my ruined silk dress around my ankles as I stepped out onto the freezing stone walk. Below me, the valley was a nightmare of blood and fire. Shen's forces were holding the line, fighting with terrifying ferocity, but Prince Jean had brought thousands of men. At the center of the battlefield, the crown prince shone with that sickening, stolen golden light, blinding the northern defenders and rallying his paladins forward. He looked invincible. He looked like a god. I pressed the jade artifact to my throat and unrolled the copied ledger. "Soldiers of the southern capital." My voice did not just carry, it boomed like a thunderclap, vibrating through the chest of every single man in the valley. The sheer volume was so startling that the clash of steel below momentarily faltered. Even Prince Jean froze, his golden head snapping upward to look at the tiny figure standing alone on the high wall. "You march under the banner of the Golden Hero," I projected, my tone sharp, carrying the absolute, unyielding authority of a woman reading an undeniable truth. "You believe his light is a divine blessing. It is not. It is a parasite." "Silence her," Jin's magically amplified voice roared back, laced with sudden, genuine panic. "Archers, bring her down." A flurry of arrows arched toward me, but the sheer height of the battlements kept me safely out of range. The arrows clattered harmlessly against the stone wall far below my feet. On the 4th day of the autumn harvest, the prince performed a miracle of light in the village of Oakhaven. I read, my voice ringing out across the frozen wastes. 2 weeks later, 53 children in Oakhaven perished from a sudden, unexplained wasting sickness. Down on the battlefield, the southern soldiers hesitated. Men from the eastern provinces lowered their shields, exchanging confused, horrified glances. On the first day of the winter frost, he healed the magistrate of Riverbend. I continued ruthlessly, moving down the ledger. A month later, 70 farmhands in Riverbend collapsed in the fields, their life forces entirely drained to feed his golden aura. He is not a savior. He is a thief of lives, using the blood of your own families to make himself shine. "Lies," Jean screamed, the perfect, heroic facade completely shattering. his handsome face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. She is beguiled by the mad warlord. Slay them all. But his soldiers did not surge forward. The doubt had been planted. I was reciting the exact dates, the exact names of the villages they called home. The administrative truth was far heavier than any magical illusion. They looked at the glowing prince, and for the first time, they didn't see divine light. They saw the graves of their families. Seeing his own men falter, Jean completely lost his mind. He shoved a group of his own paladins aside, marching toward a massive, ironwood siege ballista that had just been wheeled to the front line. He kicked the siege engineer away and grabbed the heavy crank himself. He aimed the massive weapon upward, adjusting the trajectory directly toward the high battlement. Toward me. I am the future emperor. Jean roared, his golden magic flaring wildly, dangerously unstable. He slammed his gauntlet down on the heavy iron release lever. The massive iron bolt, thick as a tree trunk and designed to shatter stone walls, launched into the air, screaming through the wind straight toward my chest. Chapter 12. The iron bolt tore through the freezing air, spinning with enough velocity to shatter solid granite. I gripped the stone parapet, my knuckles turning white, refusing to cower. An executive secretary does not flinch under pressure. But I didn't have to. A shadow eclipsed the moon. Shin didn't just climb the wall. He rode a violently erupting pillar of black ice straight up the side of the fortress, launching himself into the air directly in the path of the ballista bolt. He didn't try to dodge it. He met it head-on. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the keep, Shin swung his massive broadsword with both hands. The dark steel collided with the iron bolt mid-air. The impact rang out like a struck bell. The massive siege projectile shattered into 1,000 harmless splinters of wood and twisted iron, raining down upon the courtyard below. Shin landed heavily on the battlement right in front of me, his heavy boots cracking the stone floor. He was breathing hard, the burned silk of his robe smoking in the cold air, but he stood tall, an impenetrable shield of muscle and dark magic between me and the army below. Down in the valley, the silence was absolute. Prince Jin's army stared up at the high wall. They had just watched their golden hero attempt to artillery strike an unarmed woman reading from a ledger. And they had just watched the mad warlord, the supposed monster of the north, risk his own life to shield her. The optics had officially shifted. Treason! Jean screamed, his golden magic sputtering and flaring erratically as he felt the faith of his men slipping away. He drew his glowing longsword, his eyes wild. He uses dark magic, not a Jean snarled, his vanity overriding his tactical sense. He charged forward, his golden aura blazing as he swung his longsword. Shin didn't even use the stairs. He vaulted over the high battlement, dropping 50 feet into the valley like a meteor of dark ice. The impact cratered the frozen earth, and before the dust could even settle, Shin was moving. It was a masterclass in hostile conflict resolution. Jean fought with flashy, wide, magically enhanced strikes designed to look heroic. Shin fought with brutal, unyielding efficiency. He parried a golden strike, stepped cleanly inside the prince's guard, and drove the heavy steel pommel of his broadsword directly into Jin's armored stomach. The prince doubled over, gasping for air. Shin swept a heavy boot behind Jin's knee, sending the golden hero crashing to the mud. With a swift fluid motion, Shin kicked the glowing longsword out of Jin's hand and planted the tip of his own broadsword directly against the hollow of the prince's throat. The duel was over in less than 30 seconds. Jean spat blood into the snow, looking up at Shin with pure, unadulterated hatred. "Do it," he hissed. "Kill me. Prove to them you are the monster I said you were." Shin stood over the defeated prince. He didn't execute him. Instead, the terrifying warlord of the northern waste slowly lifted his head and looked all the way up to the high battlement. He was looking at me. He held his sword steady against the prince's throat, waiting in absolute silence for his chief administrator to issue the final directive. Chapter 13. Thousands of eyes shifted from the defeated prince to the tiny figure standing on the fortress wall. The entire valley held its breath. If Shin killed the crown prince, he would technically be committing regicide, regardless of Jin's crimes. It would plunge the empire into a messy, prolonged civil war. The corporate liability of a public execution was simply too high. I looked down at Shin, caught his icy gaze and gave a sharp, definitive downward nod. "Mercy." Shin immediately lowered his broadsword. He took a deliberate step back, removing the blade from Jin's throat. "The north is strong," Shin projected. his voice ringing with quiet, undeniable majesty. And because we are strong, we show mercy to the weak. We do not murder defeated men. It was the ultimate humiliation. Jean let out a raw scream of rage, scrambling in the mud to reach for his fallen sword, but he never made it. Two Southern generals dismounted, their expressions tight with disgust. They stepped forward, flanking the disgraced prince, and forcefully dragged him back to his knees. "Crown Prince Jean," the lead general said, his voice heavy with sorrow and anger. "By the authority of the imperial censorate and the blood of the eastern provinces, you are hereby detained for the use of forbidden arts and crimes against the peasantry." Heavy iron chains were slapped over the prince's golden gauntlets. The golden hero was officially terminated. A deafening roar erupted from the northern defenders. Cheers echoed off the mountain peaks, quickly joined by the shouts of the southern soldiers who realized they had just been spared a senseless slaughter. Shen didn't look at the cheering armies. He sheathed his broadsword, turned his back on the arrested prince, and sprinted toward the fortress gates. I didn't wait for him to reach the inner keep. I ran down the winding stone stairs, my ruined skirts flying, my heart pounding a frantic, joyous rhythm. I burst through the heavy courtyard doors just as Shen marched through the iron gates. He dropped his sword belt to the stone, crossing the courtyard in 3 massive strides. He caught me as I threw myself at him, wrapping his uninjured arm around my waist and lifting me clean off the ground. "The audit is complete, General," I whispered, tears of relief finally spilling onto his soot-stained shoulder. "You magnificent, terrifying woman," Shen laughed, a rich, beautiful sound that I had never heard before. He set me down gently, cupping my face in his large, calloused hands, and kissed me with a breathless, overwhelming reverence in front of both cheering armies. The moment was interrupted by the urgent clatter of hooves. A royal carriage, flanked by elite capital guards, pushed through the parting sea of soldiers. The door swung open, and out stepped Grand Scholar Feng. He was heavily bandaged but very much alive, having survived the real assassination attempt on the road, and riding straight to the Emperor with the copies of the ledgers I had sent him weeks ago via the tea-house couriers. The old scholar hobbled forward, unrolling a heavy silk scroll bearing the Emperor's personal dragon seal. "An imperial edict," Feng's reedy voice called out. The courtyard instantly fell silent, soldiers dropping to their knees. With the treason of Crown Prince Jean laid bare before the heavens, the Emperor has formally stripped him of his titles, recognizing the unyielding honor and loyalty of the Northern Vanguard. The Emperor hereby names General Shen as the new crown heir to the Jade Throne. I looked up at Shen, whose mouth had fallen slightly open in shock. "Well," I murmured, straightening his collar one last time, "it seems we have a lot of paperwork to file for your promotion." Epilogue. 2 years later, the imperial capital was running with an efficiency it had not seen in 4 centuries. Emperor Shen sat upon the Jade Throne, universally beloved by the Empire as the stoic guardian of the realm. The jagged, terrifying armor was permanently retired, replaced by impeccably tailored, dark silk imperial robes that made the court ladies sigh behind their fans. The former Crown Prince Jean was currently serving a life sentence doing heavy administrative filing in the deepest, dustiest, windowless archives of the Ministry of Justice, a punishment I had personally overseen the logistics for. I sat behind my massive, beautifully organized rosewood desk in the Empress's pavilion, drowning in a sea of scheduling requests, provincial trade agreements, and approval drafts for the upcoming royal baby announcement. I dipped my ink brush, preparing to sign off on a new grain tariff, when the heavy doors to my office swung open. Emperor Shen slipped inside, looking infuriatingly handsome. He casually bypassed the terrified eunuchs waiting in the hall and shut the doors, locking them with a soft click. "You are interrupting my workflow, Your Imperial Majesty," I noted, not looking up from my ledger. Shen chuckled, that deep, vibrating sound that still made my pulse race. He walked up behind my chair, his large hands coming to rest gently on my shoulders. He leaned down, resting his chin on the top of my head as he looked at the mountains of parchment. "The Empress of the realm should not be working unauthorized overtime," Shen murmured, his lips brushing the shell of my ear. He gently plucked the ink brush from my fingers and set it on the jade rest. "I am officially requisitioning my wife for the evening." I sighed, leaning back against his chest and tilting my head up to meet his icy, adoring eyes. "Managing the daily itinerary for an entire empire is exhausting, Shen." "Then let the empire wait until morning," he whispered, leaning down to capture my lips in a slow, devastatingly thorough kiss that made me instantly forget about the grain tariffs entirely. I smiled against his mouth, sliding my arms around his neck. The administrative headaches were endless, but the fringe benefits of marrying my boss made it entirely worth it.